The vote had not even been announced yet, and Varro already knew how it would go. He stood at the far end of the council chamber, a room carved from black stone at the heart of the Dominion's capital world. 43 councillors sat in a curved row above him, their robes the color of dried blood, their faces the flat gray of Drathine who had never once lost a war. The air smelled of warm circuits and old power, the way all old rooms smell when the people inside them have stopped asking hard questions. Councillor Doran was still talking. He had been talking for 20 minutes. He spoke of human worlds rich with rare metals, of human space that sat like an open door at the edge of Drathine expansion, of a species too busy fighting itself to notice the fleet assembling beyond its border. He used the word primitive 4 times. He used the word opportunity 6. He never once used the word careful. Varro had spent 11 years being careful. He had sent observers to human worlds, not soldiers. He had read their history, not their resource maps. He had watched how they handled floods, famines, plagues, and each other. He had watched what happened when a human soldier lost his weapon, his unit, his orders, and still had 1 hour of daylight left. That last detail had kept Varro awake on more nights than he could count. When Doran finished, Varro was given the floor. He did not use a display board. He did not bring charts or fleet projections. He carried one thing, a small data chip, and he held it up so the council could see it. On that chip were 11 years of field reports from embedded Drathine observers living among humans. He told the council what the chip contained. He summarized it in plain language, the way a doctor tells a patient something they do not want to hear. Humans had been at war with each other for recorded history. Every century produced new weapons. Every new weapon produced new tactics. Every new tactic got studied, copied, improved, and eventually turned against whoever invented it. They were, Varro explained, the only species he had ever studied that treated military defeat as a learning exercise rather than a conclusion. They did not stop. They did not accept that losing meant they were supposed to stop. They simply found another way. He told the council about a human battle fought 300 years ago on a planet called Garen's Reach, not an alien battle, a human one where one side was outnumbered 9-1, had no air support, no supply line, and no communication with its command. They lasted 41 days. They did not win, but they bled the other side so badly that the winning side never fully recovered and collapsed within a generation. That was a loss. That was what humans did with a loss. He put the chip on the table. He said, "I have studied 47 species in my career. I have helped this Dominion conquer 30 of them. I know what a species looks like when it is ready to be conquered. I know what it looks like when it is not. Do not attack humanity." He picked up his command insignia and placed it beside the chip. He was resigning, not because he was told to, but because he already knew what they would vote, and he did not want his name attached to what came next. Doran smiled. Several other councillors whispered to each other. One of them actually laughed, a short, dismissive sound that bounced off the black stone walls and died quickly. The vote was 14-1. The one was a junior councillor named Osset, who had never voted against anything in his career and looked terrified of himself for doing it now. Varro's aide, Reth, met him outside in the corridor. Reth was younger, quieter, and had read every one of those 11 years of field reports personally. He said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. Varro looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Record the date, Reth. We will need to know exactly when we made our last mistake." He walked out of the building without looking back. Behind him, through the thick stone walls, he could already hear Doran's voice rising again, celebrating, already speaking of timelines, of fleet deployments, of how long it would take to process 40 human colony worlds into Dominion holdings. He spoke as though it was already done. Varro stepped outside into the gray light of the capital world and looked up at the sky. Somewhere far beyond that sky, separated by years of slipspace travel, were several billion humans who did not yet know that the Dominion had just decided to take everything they had. He thought about what they would do when they found out. He walked home. That night he opened a blank document on his personal terminal and wrote 4 words at the top of the page: a history of the last war. Then he sat back and stared at them for a long time. He did not write anything else that night, but he did not delete those 4 words either. The first thing Sub-Admiral Reth noticed about the human colony was that it looked wrong. Not wrong in the way a military target looks wrong: no defensive walls, no orbital gun platforms, no warships waiting in the shadow of the nearby moon. It looked wrong the other way. It looked completely normal. Just a small mining settlement on a gray rock called Kessel 3, floating quietly in the dark, full of people pulling ore from tunnels and sending it on slow cargo ships to busier worlds. No sign they knew the Drathine fleet was coming. His fleet of 600 warships dropped out of slipspace in clean formation. The Dominion always arrived in clean formation. 47 conquests had taught them that the appearance of order caused many species to simply give up before the first shot was fired. It was efficient. It was clean. It worked. The colony did not give up. What happened next took Reth several days to fully reconstruct, because it happened in pieces, and none of it followed the pattern he had trained for his entire career. 22 minutes before his fleet reached weapons range, every communication frequency in the system lit up with a single repeating signal from the colony's surface. Not a surrender, not a plea. A message broadcast unencrypted on every channel the humans used, military and civilian alike, aimed at anyone within range who could receive it. It said in simple language, "We are under attack. Here are the coordinates. Here is the fleet size. Here is what they look like." Just that. Cold, factual, useful to anyone who might come later. Then the asteroid belt moved. Reth was still trying to understand the communication broadcast when his forward sensor officer reported that several thousand objects in the belt were no longer drifting on natural orbits. They were accelerating. They were being pushed not by engines, but by the colony's industrial mass driver network, the same machinery that normally launched ore pods at cargo ships. Someone on that colony had spent the last 22 minutes reprogramming every mass driver on the rock to fire chunks of ore and compressed metal containers at his fleet. Not aimed precisely, just aimed generally. Into the space his ships had to pass through to reach the colony. It was not a weapons system. It was a mining operation pointed sideways. His fleet could not stop. The geometry of a slipspace drop meant you arrived moving fast and it took time to slow down. The ore chunks were not precise. Most of them missed, but most was not all, and his ships were large and there were many chunks and the belt was very full. He lost 11 ships in the first 2 minutes, not to weapons, to rocks. His point defense systems, built to handle energy weapons and guided missiles, were not designed for a continuous storm of irregular metal objects ranging from the size of a ground vehicle to the size of a small building. They burned through power reserves trying to shoot debris that did not stop coming. Then the drones appeared. They came from the colony's surface, from its maintenance bays and construction yards, small industrial machines rebuilt overnight into something that flew fast and hit hard. Not military drones. Mining drones, cargo drones, survey drones with their sensor heads ripped out and replaced with whatever the colonists had available. They were not accurate. They were not durable. Several of them flew into each other. It did not matter, because there were thousands of them, and they cost Reth another 29 ships before he reached the colony's atmosphere. He took the colony. It took 4 hours and cost him 74 warships and 31,000 soldiers to capture one small mining settlement with a population of 9,000 civilians. The colonists did not fight in the open. They went underground, into the tunnel networks they had spent decades building, and they made every junction, every passage, every maintenance shaft a decision that cost his soldiers time and blood. They were not trained soldiers. They were miners and engineers and cargo workers, and they still made his forces pay for every step. When it was finally over, Reth sat in the colony's command center and looked at the numbers his officers laid in front of him. Then he looked at a map of human space. There were 400 colonies marked on it. Some were larger than this one. Many were older, with deeper tunnels and more infrastructure to turn into improvised weapons. He wrote his report to the High Council that night. He wrote it plainly and without decoration, the way Varro had always taught him reports should be written. He listed what had happened, what it had cost, and what it suggested about the 400 worlds still ahead of them. The Council's reply came 3 days later. It said his losses were within acceptable parameters and that he should proceed to the next target without delay. He read the reply twice. Then he set it aside and looked out through the colony's scarred viewport at the stars, and he thought about something Varro had said to him once, that the most dangerous thing about humans was not what they did to you in the first battle. It was what they were doing in every battle after it, while you were still busy counting the cost of the first one. He called for his next set of charts and told his navigation officer to plot a course. He did not sleep that night. The signal from Kessel 3 reached Earth 17 hours after the colony sent it. By that point, the colony was already gone. But the signal was not meant to save Kessel 3. The person who sent it knew it could not save Kessel 3. It was meant to do exactly what it did, which was arrive on Earth with precise coordinates, fleet numbers, ship dimensions, approach vectors, and the very specific detail that the alien vessels had no visible point defense systems on their rear hulls. That last detail would matter later. It would matter enormously. The emergency session of the United Nations lasted 9 minutes. This was not because the representatives were careless. It was because every nation on Earth had a contingency protocol for first contact of a hostile kind, and those protocols had been written, revised, wargamed, and revised again for 200 years, ever since humanity first admitted to itself that the universe was very large and probably not empty. When the session opened, there was genuinely nothing to debate. The vote for Unified War Command was unanimous. That had never happened before. Not once in the entire recorded history of the United Nations had every member voted the same way on anything. The Emergency Unification Accord was signed in 71 hours. Every human nation, every colony world, every orbital station added its name to a single document that said, in plain language, that humanity was now one thing for the purpose of this war. The politicians who signed it had spent careers arguing with each other about trade, borders, resource rights, and 1,000 other things. They signed the accord anyway, because some situations make old arguments feel very small. Admiral Bren Salak was given command of the unified fleet the same day. He was not the most decorated officer in the human military. He was not the oldest or the most famous. He was chosen because he had spent 30 years studying every war humanity had ever fought and writing papers about what all of them had in common. His conclusion, which had made him unpopular with people who liked simple answers, was that humans won wars not by being the strongest side, but by being the side that best understood what the enemy could not afford to lose. Find the thing they cannot lose, go for that, everything else is distraction. His first order was unexpected. He did not order the fleet to form up and march toward the enemy. He ordered every ship to scatter. The human colonies in the outer systems received instructions to disassemble anything that looked like a military target and rebuild it as something that looked like nothing. Supply depots were buried in asteroid fields. Communication relays were split into hundreds of tiny nodes spread across vast distances. The human fleet stopped existing as a fleet and became, instead, a very large number of small, fast, hard-to-find things moving through territory they had spent generations learning. The Drathian advance continued. They took colonies, one by one, and each one cost them more than the last. The colonists had heard what happened at Kessel 3, and they had adapted. Each world found its own version of the Orchunk trick. One colony flooded its tunnels with a corrosive chemical compound used in ore processing then opened the ventilation to the surface just as Drathine soldiers entered. Another colony's residents dismantled every vehicle they owned, combined the parts into one enormous remote-controlled machine, and drove it directly into the lead Drathine transport ship at full speed as it landed. A third colony did something that took Reth's analysts a week to fully understand. They had somehow precisely mapped the resonant frequency of Drathine hull plating from the first battle's sensor data, and they built speakers. Very large speakers. The hull damage was considerable. Every one of these was different. None of them had been ordered from above. They were ideas that individual humans had in the time between hearing the enemy was coming and the enemy arriving. Meanwhile, Dr. Nadia Fenn was working. She was not a military officer. She was a physicist who had spent her career studying faster-than-light theory and had been told, repeatedly, that practical FTL was 3 generations away. She had always privately believed this estimate was made by people who had never genuinely needed to go faster. Now humanity genuinely needed to go faster. She and her team worked from a captured piece of Drathine slipspace equipment recovered from a ship destroyed at Kessel 3. It had been badly damaged, but it was enough. The technical gap between understanding how something works and building one yourself is significant. Fenn closed it in 11 weeks by the simple method of not sleeping very much and refusing to accept any answer that was not yes, and here is how. Project Underlayer produced its first working human slipspace drive 11 weeks after it started. Within a month, the design was being built into every new human warship rolling off the construction yards, and the construction yards were running at a pace that made Drathine analysts, when they eventually saw the production numbers, go very quiet. On his estate, far from all of this, Varro received a package from an old contact still embedded in human space. It contained a copy of Kessel 3's final broadcast, the cold, factual, emotionless message that had gone out on every frequency the moment the Drathine arrived. He read it 3 times. Then he opened his unfinished document and wrote a new line beneath the title. He wrote they did not ask for help. They sent information, because they already knew what help would look like, and they wanted to make sure it arrived correctly shaped. He stared at that line for a while. Then he kept writing. There was a region of space between human territory and the Drathine supply corridor that no serious military commander had ever considered using for fleet movement. It was called the break-in corridor on Drathine charts, and on those charts it was marked in the simplest possible way, a red zone with a single notation that translated, roughly, as, "Do not go here." The reason was a pulsar, a fast-spinning dead star that swept the entire corridor with radiation at regular intervals, like a lighthouse built by something that wanted to kill ships. The radiation was not instantly lethal to vessels. It was something worse. It was the kind of radiation that crept into electronics over hours and days, quietly corrupting navigation systems, then life support calibrations, then the small precise machines that kept a large warship from becoming a very expensive piece of drifting wreckage. Drathine ships were large. They had a lot of sensitive electronics. They had run the numbers a long time ago, and the numbers said the break-in corridor was not worth the risk under any circumstances. Admiral Salak had run the same numbers. Then he had run different numbers about human ship hull composition, about the radiation hardening his engineers had quietly been adding to human vessel designs for years, because human space had several naturally radioactive regions that Drathine space did not. And human engineers were nothing if not practical about things that might kill them eventually. He had run numbers about crew endurance under radiation exposure, with proper shielding protocols. He had run numbers about how long it would take his fleet to cross the corridor versus how long it would take the Drathine to react if they came out the other side. The numbers said it was possible, just with the right ships, the right crews, and 2 weeks of training inside a simulated pulsar environment that his people built inside the hollow core of a dead asteroid. The Drathine had been in a forward advance for 9 months. Their supply lines stretched long and thin from the capital worlds to the front. Fleet Commander Das, who had replaced Reth as forward commander after Reth's increasingly alarmed reports were deemed too negative, had extended those lines further to accelerate the pace of conquest. Das was ambitious in the way that people become ambitious when they have only ever seen victories, without any real understanding of what the edge of a losing position looks like from the inside. The human fleet entered the break-in corridor from the far side in small groups, running on minimal electronics, with crews in shielded rotation shifts, navigating by a method Salak's team had developed specifically for this crossing. They came through in 11 days. Several ships suffered minor system damage. None of them were lost. They emerged directly behind the Drathine supply chain. The Drathine forward fleet, already slowed by months of grinding resistance across dozens of colonies, turned to find that the supply ships it depended on were gone, the depot stations behind it were gone, and the communication relays connecting it to the Dominion capital were very specifically and very thoroughly gone. Salak had not attacked the forward fleet at all. He had removed everything behind it. Das ordered a fighting withdrawal. His captains tried. They were tired, they were low on fuel, and the routes they needed to use were no longer clear because human strike groups were in them. What started as a fighting withdrawal became, over 4 days, a collapse. Reth watched it from the command barge at the rear of the Drathine formation. He had been moved to a coordination role after his reports became too uncomfortable for high command. He watched his fleet's movements on the display and felt something he had not felt in a very long career of war. He felt the specific, cold understanding of a man who has just seen the trap close. Not a trap he walked into by accident. A trap that was built around him while he was busy watching the door in front. He sent a message to Varro. It said only, "You were right, what do we do?" Varro replied in 4 words, "Ask for terms now." Reth forwarded both messages to Counselor Doran on the capital world. Doran, who had staked his reputation and his political future on this war, did not ask for terms. He ordered Das to counterattack with the reserve fleet, the last significant Drathine military force, held back specifically to deliver a finishing blow when the humans were worn down. Salak had expected this. He had, in fact, designed the entire battle around the assumption that a commander like Doran, faced with a losing position he could not psychologically accept, would commit the reserve rather than admit the position. The reserve fleet came forward into a corridor that looked open. It was not open. Human ships had been sitting in the debris fields and the sensor shadows for days, running cold and quiet, waiting for exactly this. The reserve fleet lasted 6 hours. Reth survived only because his command barge was not a warship and was not treated as a threat. When it was boarded, the human soldiers who came through the airlock found him sitting in his command chair in the dark, the displays still showing the last moments of the reserve fleet's destruction, his hands flat on the table. He had made no attempt to arm himself or resist. He had turned on a single light and waited. The human who stepped forward was General Adra, older now than the reports described her, with a scar along her jaw from a tunnel fight in the early months of the war. She looked at him for a moment. Then she set a ration pack on the table in front of him. She said, "Sit down, it's over for you." He was already sitting. He understood what she meant. He nodded once and was grateful, in a way he had no words for, that the first human he properly met was someone who did not feel the need to be cruel about winning. The human fleet did not arrive at the Drathine home system with guns firing. That was the part that confused everyone on the capital world the most. They had spent months preparing for an orbital bombardment. They had emergency shelters, evacuation plans, last resort countermeasures. They had argued endlessly in the council chamber about what to do when the humans arrived in force, and every single argument had been built on the assumption that when humans came, they would come the way the Dominion always came, with overwhelming force applied immediately, loudly, and without pause. Instead, the human fleet dropped out of slip space at the edge of the system, took up a holding position outside weapons range, and stopped. Not an aggressive stop, not a threatening circle. They simply parked in a very large and organized way and waited. For 3 days, nothing happened. The capital world's defense network stayed active. Several Drathine commanders pushed to open fire first, to take advantage of the range before the humans could close it. They were overruled each time, partly because no one was fully certain the humans were not still moving more ships into position somewhere else, and partly because even Doran, diminished now, quieter, with the permanent look of someone who has made a decision they cannot take back, no longer trusted his own military judgment enough to start the last battle. On the 4th day, Secretary General Hiraos broadcast a message on every frequency the Drathine used. She had a calm voice. She was not young, and she was not performing toughness, the way leaders sometimes do when they want the other side to know they have won. She simply said, "We are here to talk. We are not here to destroy your world. We have no interest in your extinction. We do have a great deal of interest in an agreement that makes this stop. We will wait as long as is necessary. We will not fire first. We are here to talk." That was the whole message. She said it in Drathine, translated by the prisoner Reth, who had agreed to assist without being asked. He had volunteered the moment he understood what the broadcast was. He had also quietly added one personal sentence at the end that was not in Osai's original script. He added, "This is Reth, Sub-Admiral, Drathine Dominion, currently in human custody. Everything they are telling you is true. Ask for Grand General Varro." It was not authorized. Os heard the addition in the playback and said nothing about it, because it was exactly the right thing to add. The council chamber was near empty by the time the summons for Varro arrived. Some members had gone home to their families. One had officially resigned, citing health reasons. Doran was still present because he had nowhere else to go and because he had not yet fully accepted what had happened, in the way that some people stand in the rain without moving because understanding that they are getting wet would require them to also understand that they have no shelter. Varro arrived without ceremony. He was older. He walked with a cane he had not needed before the war started. He looked around the half-empty room at the remaining counselors, at the empty seats, at the light coming through the high windows. The same windows he had looked at when he placed his insignia on the table and walked out, and he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You should have let me finish my report." He accepted the role of negotiator because he was the only person the council could offer that the humans might trust, and because he believed the terms would be better if he handled them than if they were handled by someone who still needed to feel like they had not entirely lost. His one condition was the return of Reth, unharmed, before negotiations began. Osa agreed in under an hour. Reth was on a transport home the following morning, with a bag of human ration packs that he had apparently, over several weeks of captivity, developed a genuine preference for over-Drathine field food. He said nothing about this to anyone and disposed of the bag before arrival. The peace talks lasted 9 days. Osai's terms were studied, deliberate, and by every measure Varro had of how conquering powers behaved, almost without precedent. There was no annexation of Drathine home worlds. There was no occupation. There were no reparations paid in resources or in labor. What there was, clearly and firmly and without room for argument, was the complete dissolution of the Drathine Dominion's empire. Every species the Dominion had absorbed over centuries was to be released, given back their worlds, given access to technology sufficient to protect themselves, and left alone. The Drathine civilization was not touched. Its home worlds, its culture, its population, untouched. Only its power over others ended. Doran stood up once during the proceedings to argue that these terms were humiliating. Varro told him, quietly and without heat, to sit down. Doran sat down. He did not stand up again. Varro read every line of the agreement twice. He checked the translation 3 times. Then he picked up the signing instrument and wrote his name at the bottom of the document with the clean, steady hand of someone who has been waiting a very long time to put the right words in the right place. He was the last to sign. He was also the first to leave the room. He had somewhere to be. He went home and opened his document and kept writing. The lecture hall at the Drathine Institute for Interspecies Strategy held 200 students. On the morning that Reth delivered what would become his most recorded lecture, 340 were present. The extra 140 had heard something was different about today and had crowded in standing along the walls, which violated the building's occupancy rules, which Reth ignored because he had spent too much of his life enforcing rules that turned out to be wrong. He did not begin with a display board or a prepared text. He began by standing at the front of the room for a moment in silence, looking at his students the way old soldiers sometimes look at young people, with a mix of relief and something harder to name. Then he said, "I am going to tell you why we lost, not how, why." A student in the third row, a young Drathine named Saul who had enrolled specifically because of the war and wanted to understand it, raised his hand. Reth nodded at him. Saul asked, if General Varro knew what would happen, why didn't they listen to him? Reth was quiet for a moment, not because he did not have an answer, because the answer was long and the question deserved the full version. He said, because Varro told the council something their entire history had not prepared them to believe. He told them that something smaller than them, weaker than them, more chaotic and divided than them, could still destroy them. And the council looked at the word destroy and thought it was impossible, so they stopped listening before he finished. Pride is not a feeling. It is a filter. It decides what information you allow in and what you do not. The council's filter was set to reject any information that contradicted the assumption that size and order win. Varro was telling them that in some situations, size and order are exactly what the other side is planning around. They did not receive that message, not because they weren't intelligent, because they had decided in advance it could not be true. The hall was very quiet. Saul asked one more question. What made humans different from the others we conquered? Reth thought about Kessel 3. He thought about ore chunks in the dark. He thought about miners who had never held military weapons in their lives, spending 22 minutes turning their entire world into a weapon. He thought about a woman handing him a ration pack in a broken corridor and not being cruel about it. He said, every species we conquered believed at some point that they had reached the limit of what they could do. Humans never found that limit, not because they were physically superior, because every time they came to the edge of what they knew, they treated it as a question rather than a wall. They asked, what else can this become? What else can I use? The ore chunks, the mining drones, the resonance speakers, the slipspace drive built in 11 weeks from a damaged part. Every single one of those was a human standing at the edge of what they knew and refusing to call it a wall. He paused, then added, and they did that to each other for thousands of years before they ever met us. We gave them one more reason to do it. That was all we were to them. One more reason. The lecture ended. Most of the students stayed in their seats for several minutes afterward, the way people do when they have been told something that rearranges the furniture in their mind. General Adra arrived at Varro's estate on a gray afternoon 6 months after the peace was signed. She came as part of a joint diplomatic delegation, but she went to the estate alone, which the delegation permitted because Reth had quietly explained to the human diplomatic staff who Varro was and what he had done, and the staff had understood. Varro met her in his study. He was very old now, and the cane from the peace talks had become 2 canes, and he moved slowly. But his eyes were the same as they had been in Reth's reports from 11 years ago, when the observers first noted that the Grand General seemed unusually interested in human field behavior, clear and precise and permanently unsurprised. She told him that the human military academies had found his council speech in captured Drathine records and added it to the required reading list for every first-year officer. He found this very funny. He laughed for longer than she expected, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine. Then he asked her, "What do your cadets learn from it?" She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "To listen to the person in the room who is most afraid of winning, because that person has usually read the situation more carefully than everyone else." Varro nodded slowly. He looked out his window at the sky. He said, "That is more wisdom than my own council had in 40 years of meetings." He died 33 days later, at home in the night. He was found in the morning by the caretaker of the estate, in his chair by the window, with his terminal open on his desk. The document was still open. It was very long now. The last line, written 2 nights before his death, in handwriting that had gotten very small and very deliberate, read, "They did not lose because humans were stronger. They lost because humans refused to accept that they were weaker. And in all my years, in all my wars, in every species I ever studied, I never encountered a more dangerous idea than that. The refusal to be limited by what you are. They carried it like a weapon they did not know they were holding. We walked into it. We were warned." The document was published in full the following year, under the title he had given it on the first night, A History of the Last War. It became required reading in Drathine schools within a decade. By then, humans and Drathine were already building something new together, not an empire, something that did not have a name yet, which both sides considered a promising sign.